I will leave a couple minutes when I switch from history and background to the description. I'll leave a couple minutes for questions. But if I totally lose somebody, you can ask a question anytime. So might as well start. Next slide. So as I sort of insinuated, we've been around for a long time, the Regional Planning Commission, the early 1960s. One of the first things that we did was identify an earlier version of the environmental corridors. We did not create this concept. We built on some work that was done by others, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. I'd also probably should mention, so that first identified in 1966, I believe that was our first regional land use plan. It contains the best, these environmental corridors contain the best remaining elements of the natural resource base: woodlands, wetlands, wildlife habitat, lakes, rivers, streams. I'll get into those details. And it includes a majority of all those features as well. In total, is about 18% of the 7-county region. This was back in 2010. We haven't updated these numbers yet, but eventually we will. We recommend protection and preservation of these areas. Some of our plans go into a lot of detail on this. Acquisition, regulation, limited development in the upland areas. I'll touch on all of those as well in more detail in further slides. You can go to the next slide. I did want to hit on a little timeline of major milestones in these environmental corridors. So again, we've built on ideas from others that goes back, at least the version of environmental corridors most closely related to what we use, goes back to 1906. Charles Whitnell, I believe, they named the park after him in Milwaukee County. He did an urban version. He put it in a plan. It was then sort of used in Milwaukee County Park System work. Later on, Professor Phil Lewis from UW-Madison came up with an expanded concept, more details, and some work that he did for the governor that he did include in a plan. And that concept is the one that we used as the foundation of our environmental corridors, and then we in turn expanded upon that. Again, that 1966 would be, I believe, our first regional land use plan. 1979 is a big milestone. That was our regional water quality management plan. That's the plan that's related to that all the sewer service area plans are amendments of. That was required by the state and the feds to prepare these plans for water quality protection, and we used it to identify publicly owned sewage treatment plants and the areas to be served by those treatment plants. Interesting fact was, back then at the beginning, we were only recommending the protection and preservation of the primary environmental corridors. We didn't even map in some of our plans the secondaries and isolateds, and therefore had no recommendations for them. As time went by, we started to do that. So skipping ahead a couple years, 1981, we did, SEWRPC staff prepared a technical record that actually further refined the current definition of environmental corridors, the point system, the size criteria. All those things were identified, refined in this technical record article. That is the current definition and standards and criteria of our current environmental corridors. And then, like I mentioned before, in the early mid 80s, we started doing these sewer service area plans, which were amendments to that regional water quality management plan. And we started recommending protection of those secondary environmental corridors, which are the SECs, and the isolated natural resource areas, which are the INRAs. And that was a big step because this is where, to use that common phrase, the rubber hits the road. People are using these sewer service area plans, developers to decide, what restrictions they might encounter, local communities to decide if that's going to become part of their development review and approval process. They can adopt this in their plans or ordinances if they wish, or just be aware that there's an organization that has to comment on all these issues when we review sanitary sewer extensions, and so the local communities need to be aware of that. 1997, we had completed our 2020 regional land use plan. Finally now, outside of those sewer service areas, we have a regional plan that specifically maps and recommends the preservation of the secondaries and isolated natural areas. 1997 is also the time when the DNR and Department of Commerce back then, which is now the Department of Safety and Professional Services now, had their Wisconsin administrative codes specifically state that their review of sanitary sewer extensions, the DNR for public sewer extensions, the Department of Safety and Professional Services for private sanitary sewer extensions, had to review and approve those for conformance with this regional water quality management plan. And in many regions of the state, not just here in Southeast Wisconsin, these sewer service area plans, which are amendments of that regional plan. So that was a big step forward, really tying what our recommendations are in our plans to these sewer service areas and to the sanitary sewer extension review process that the state has. 1997, that second to last bullet point, I also want to mention that they specifically identified that the lowland portions of our secondaries and isolated natural areas typically would not be eligible for sewer development. So that part is not in the administrative code. That part is policy by those two agencies, starting from about that time. And it's consistent with what they've been doing in the rest of the state too. I did some of this same work for another part of the state for a while, and they were implementing that back then as well in the northeast part of the state. Then 2006, probably the biggest, the last biggest milestone, we've put together a guideline for development that would be compatible with these environmental corridors. Currently it's set forth, and so it was originally in a 2035 regional plan back in 2006. It's currently in our 2025 or 2050 regional plan, which we call Vision 2050, in Appendix K in Volume 3, Table K1. So that sets forth the current guidelines for development compatible with environmental corridors. Next slide. Again, going into a little bit more detail about those milestones, background and history. Again, Charles Whitnell, part of the Milwaukee County Park Commission, urban version of the corridors. They used it in their parkway system plans back then. So this goes back to the early 1900s. Phil Lewis, then a professor at UW-Madison, expanded upon that, actually termed or defined, created that definition, that term, environmental corridors. That's the report that he prepared on behalf of the governor. Next slide. Again, in a little bit more detail, the SEWRPC Regional Water Quality Management Plan, where these primary environmental corridors were recommended for preservation and protection and were mapped, shows up in that 1979 report. That report was required by the DNR and the feds. It's related to Section 208, the Federal Water Pollution, Clean Water Act, excuse me. Then there were new rules adopted by the DNR back in 1979 as well. Specifically, and most importantly, would be the NR 121. That talks about these sewer service area planning, talks about these publicly owned sewage treatment plants having to identify the area tributary to the plant, and only within that area can public sewers be extended and development connected to them. And within those areas, and this is the part that relates to the corridors, within those areas tributary to the publicly owned sewage treatment plants, those areas which are unsuitable for sewer development because of the potential for adverse water quality impacts. That is the relationship to the environmental corridors. That is also why a few years later the DNR said we had to recommend protection of the lowland portions of the secondaries and isolates too, because if developed, those areas would have the potential for adverse water quality impacts. And then the last bullet point is the specific administrative codes that apply to the public sewer extensions, NR 110, and then the private sewer extensions, SPS 382. Next slide. I touched on this already, that NR 121, the administrative code for sewer service area planning, it specifically talks about identifying areas tributary to these plants, which we term, and most areas of the regional planning commissions also term sewer service areas. That's the area that public sewers can only be extended within. There's a process to amend and update those over time, based on population projections, capacity of the treatment plant, consistency with the facility plan that's prepared for that public sewage treatment plant. So it goes into details that, about that. That's all in NR 121. And also, I don't want to forget and point out that there's more details explaining the stuff in NR 121 on the DNR's website. If you just Google sewer service area planning, Wisconsin DNR, they have a website that focuses on just what does NR 121 means for sewer service area planning and what their policies have that they've created over all these decades. Because remember, this goes back to the 1980s. So it's been done in Wisconsin for almost 50 years now. And then also, they don't call it environmental corridors. They call it those areas which, if developed for sewer development, could have a potential adverse water quality impact. And then they list natural resource features, and it specifically says, wetlands, floodways, shorelands, steep slopes, areas of porous soils, and other such factors. So it doesn't say environmental corridors. It doesn't list all the natural resource features, but it clearly states it's giving an example of some, and it's including but not limited to those. And then again, the policies over the decades is that regional planning commissions will create their own version of these environmental corridors, and that's what we have to use for our review of sewer extensions and our review and preparation of sewer service area plans. A little bit more detail then about those policies by the DNR and the Department of Safety and Professional Services. This language comes straight from our current regional land use plan, Vision 2050. This is also the language that we try to use in our sewer extension letters. If there is development within or adjacent to these corridors, it could be an issue. Bottom line is very limited development is allowed within the primary environmental corridors, period. And those are the most common exceptions to that rule: limited recreational, limited institutional, rural density residential development, and rural density being a maximum of 1 dwelling unit per 5 acres, in areas other than wetlands, floodplains, riparian buffers, which are shorelands, and adjacent steep slopes. Those are the lowland portions of the corridor. And then for the secondary environmental corridors and isolated natural resource areas, we recommend their protection and preservation, the upland portions of those. But for this sewer service area planning for sewer extensions, that is purely just a recommendation. It's up to the local unit of government to decide if they want to protect that upland portion. But we do have to recommend the protection of the lowland portions and base our recommendation on that sewer extension or sewer service area amendment on being consistent with the preservation of that lowland portions. DNR has indicated that in most instances, they will not approve development within the lowland portions of those environmental corridors. So that's where it sort of gets confusing. It's all a recommendation from SEWRPC. But that part, the lowland portions of the secondary corridor in the isolated natural areas, it's still a recommendation, but that's backed 99% of the time by the DNR, that you have to stay out of those areas. Next slide. So again, our general recommendation, so as I'm building up to, there is a difference in how these corridors are protected, what our recommendations are inside sewer service areas and outside sewer service areas. So this is our across the board recommendation in our plans for the primary environmental corridors, preserving essentially natural open uses. We have that limited development that's allowed, the rural density residential, All those kinds of things are considered on a case-by-case basis, so it's not intended to be all the time, because it depends on the specifics of that situation. But that's our standard recommendation across the board: preserve all the primary corridors and essentially natural open uses. Across the board recommendation for secondary environmental corridors and isolated natural areas: again, preserve and essentially natural open uses to the greatest extent practicable as determined by county and local plans. That's our standard across the board. That's really the final word in our recommendations outside the sewer service areas, but it's a little bit different inside. The regional land use and transportation plan I've mentioned, Vision 2050, has all the current information on these recommendations, the terminology that we use, the specific recommendations, the difference between the sewer service area and outside. All that's set forth in these various sections of Volume 3 of our Vision 2050 plan. So that's the background and history. Next one, I'll go into more details about point criteria and all that kind of stuff. Any questions so far? And I will, at the end, talk a little bit more about the difference between inside the sewer service areas and outside the sewer service areas. So I'm going to take a quick drink of water. I would mention, or I could mention, I suppose, other regional planning commissions have their own variations of these environmental corridors. The only one that I'm familiar with is the one that's in Brown County. They are also one of these regional planning commissions that were designated by the governor. Their version of environmental corridors, they just call them environmentally significant areas, or ESAs. Their definition was they have protected all the wetlands plus a buffer and a setback. So the buffer is the bigger one, the buffer is the smaller one where no development is allowed, and the setback is the larger one where structures are not allowed, but earth moving activities are. And that's no matter what the size of the wetland is. That's part of their version of the corridors. Then they've protected others, floodplains, shorelands, and only woodlands when they're directly related to one of those features. So they don't protect isolated stands of woods. That's their version of the environmental corridors. So other regions do something similar, but their definitions of the corridors are different. The process that they do for these sewer extension reviews, sewer service area amendments are different as well. But they all go back to, they have to be consistent with the NR 121, the administrative code. Okay, next one, next portion of the presentation. So I'm going to talk about some of the specifics and details in this technical record of how we refine and delineate these environmental corridors. So next. So just starting with these natural resource-based elements. So the concept is we've identified all the natural resource-based elements in the region. We put maps together and identified these features, and there'll be a couple more slides, and assigned them point values. So we have major lakes, minor lakes, rivers and streams, shorelands. In some of these categories, we break them down. So in shorelands associated with perennial streams, shorelands associated with intermittent streams, the Lake Michigan Bluff. Next slide. Floodplains, wetlands, so I'm not going to repeat all of these, but we've identified all these natural resource features, call them base elements, natural resource base elements, because we got natural resource base related elements coming up soon too. So we've identified all of these, created a point system based on their importance in natural resources. From wildlife habitat, water quality protection, for recreation, for various purposes and reasons, more than just the water quality that the DNR requires in the NR 121. So again, these are the categories that we've mapped. Many of you, if you have done wetland environmental corridor delineations before, you will have seen all of these on those 1975 environmental corridor composite maps. That's always one of the features that we want you to use when you're creating your environmental corridor delineation as a background check and the foundation to build upon. And Chris is going to go into more detail on that. Next slide. So again, now we're talking some of these related elements, existing and proposed park sites. Same thing, we've identified different categories of these features, identified point systems, and we'll get into the points in a little bit later on as well. Includes some things that don't have a direct natural resource impact, like a scenic view. Indirectly they do. A lot of those features at steep slopes. But this element of it is scenic viewpoint, just standing on that site, and certain criteria has to be met, that you have certain relief, elevation, ability to see a certain distance. That's all part of that, and these are all defined in that technical record. Next slide. So again, historic sites, again, not usually directly related to natural resource features. Natural areas are a big part of it. A more recent change that we've done since the original technical record article is we've added critical species habitat sites now as an element to our environmental corridors, as you can tell by the point systems, and I'll get into it a little bit later. It's only 5 points, which means that by itself is not enough to be an environmental corridor, but we'll talk about that later. Next slide. So that's really quick on that element. There's one more part, I'll spend more detail on that. Any questions so far? Yes.
So if the floodplain, Hardier floodplain is part of the lowland areas you're describing, why is it only 3 points? I've been running into this where if all this is floodplain, but yet that is the defining part of the corridor.
Yep.
Why?
Because, and Dave can correct me if I miss anything, Dave Schilling, by the way, is my predecessor. He knows this stuff better than I do. So if I make a major mistake, he'll say something. If I miss anything major, he should say something too. But for floodplains, so the idea is floodplains are not always in their natural condition. They can be farmed, they can be developed. The rules and regulations allow some development. We understood that when we were creating this. So floodplain by itself would not be enough to be an environmental corridor, because there are many instances where activities are allowed in that floodplain, farming and certain types of development, which would not be compatible with an environmental corridor. So that's why we know that happens often. So that's why by itself a floodplain is not enough to be an environmental corridor. It also has to be something else. Now there is what we used to use, or what we used to call planned corridors, inside sewer service areas or immediately adjacent to sewer service areas. We would identify floodplains as future additions to the corridor at such time as that floodplain, and a similar idea with farmed wetlands as well. At such time as that area is no longer actively farmed, it starts to revert to its natural conditions, it will become part of that primary, or part of that adjacent environmental corridor. It could be a primary, it could be a secondary, rarely would it ever be isolated. So we've taken that into account, that over time it could change, they could stop farming it, it starts to become vegetated, it becomes part of the corridor. We try to anticipate that by showing that on a separate map in our sewer service area plans. And then in our regional mapping efforts, we don't show that as part of the corridors. That's just something that we have to keep track of and remind everybody that, hey, there's a floodplain out there. It's a part of and adjacent and extends outside of that corridor. If it's inside a sewer service area, it's going to be recommended that when that area stops being farmed and starts to revegetate, it will become part of the corridor. Outside the sewer service areas, only if the local community wanted to do that would it really become part of the corridor. Because remember, by itself, it's not enough to be an environmental corridor. So, yes?
When you're distinguishing between primary and secondary, is it a point ranking system?
And size criteria.
And the criteria.
Yeah. So I'll get into that. That'll be in the next part too. But yeah, There are differences. We've always intended there be differences between these primary, secondary, isolated. You know, and the history was we recommended protection of only the primary at the very beginning. It was only a little bit later that we started recommending protection of the secondary and isolated. And the recommendation wording is a little bit different. We specifically state in our recommendation that it's to be considered for protection, subject to the decisions of the local community and their plans. We don't say that about the primaries. We always recommend that the primaries always be preserved and protected. Any plan that we'll do for a local community, we will always include that in the plan. I've even talked to our executive director. Would there ever be an instance where we would not want to do somebody's local plan? That would be one of the few exceptions, one of the few instances. If somebody said, yeah, we want SEWRPC to do our comprehensive plan or our park plan or whatever it is, but we don't want to protect any of the primaries. We want you to say that in the plan. We'd say, sorry, we'll have to find somebody else to do that plan. We wouldn't do it. So that's the primaries. We have budged a little bit on the secondaries and isolateds. There are local and county plans that don't protect all of those. So there's always that intention from the very beginning that there was a hierarchy here. From the DNR standpoint, for the sewer service area planning and sewer extension reviews, there's a difference there. They don't care as much about that hierarchy, primary, secondary, isolated. They care more about what could have a potential adverse water quality impact. They support all these corridors to the extent that they can, and they have. But push comes to shove, it's the water quality impact. So there is a difference. Any other questions? Yes, Dave.
With respect to the floodplains, when we did the early test drives of applying the points on the ground, and we initially had floodplains as 10 points, but then when you mapped that, what Joel indicated is there was huge amounts of it. We did in Kenosha County, huge amounts of floodplain that was in agriculture use, and there was no way we were going to put in a plan that agriculture use was in conflict, you know, with the environmental corridor, and that's why we reduced it back down, because then recreation uses too are often inside of the floodplain.
Because those, from a regional perspective in our plans, those are almost equally as important recommendations in our plans to preserve agricultural and provide recreational opportunities. Those are recommendations that are just about as important as our environmental corridors. Our regional plans are based on a whole series of recommendations that include those. So yeah, we early on noticed that there was going to be a conflict there, so then we did have to adjust.
Maybe an asterisk by that three.
Yeah, it could be. It'll be interesting as time goes by. All this information becomes more and more available. People use it more and more, and then turnover, staff, whatever. I always wonder what it's going to look like, 10, 20, 30 years from now. How much detail we'll have available on our website. All these explanations and stuff, will that be out there? Because people talk about transparency more and more often in government. I wonder what it's going to be like. All that information will be more readily available, but you need to know where to look to find it. I think that's always going to be an issue. But anyway, moving on, unless there's any other questions, because we're leaving time, so questions are welcome. Okay, next. So now we're going into this more detailed discussion of how we identify the corridors. So we're talking about resource and resource-related, both elements, and those are in the previous slides, and that was all of the elements. We identified on these 1975 aerial photographs at that 1 inch to 400 foot scale. That's what we typically used and still use for some purposes. We identified each of those elements, and we identified where they overlap. So areas can be just one element and one associated point value. A specific area could be a number of overlapping elements, and then you add all those point values together. So we identify those elements, we identify the point values, we identify where they overlap, We're drawing this on a map, we're identifying polygons, the technical computer mapping and terminology, because now we're starting to do more of this on GIS. As part of that technical record article, we identified that anything that was 10 points or more was eligible to be an environmental corridor, but it's more than just a point value. It's also got to meet the size criteria, and then we have other criteria like linking and things. So it has to meet all those criteria, but this is the first step. Potentially can be part of an environmental corridor once it reaches 10 points. Definitely it can be more than 10 points if there's enough overlapping elements. There's a couple elements that are more than 10 points. I think state natural areas are 15. So we've identified all those polygons, their point values, where they overlap, what the totals are. One of the things that we didn't assign point values to is these wet, poor soils. That was just talk louder and louder and louder. Okay, that's okay. Thanks. Moving on, next one. Hopefully the rest of that comes up soon, because there's more. Can it be this way? So those are the point values, but we don't see the polygons yet. Hit it again, see if it comes out. So let's see if we advance the next slide. There you go. So we have the point values associated with these polygons, color-coded in this instance, goes along with the different elements that are on the right side of the screen. So as you can see here, it's on an aerial photo base. We delineate these areas based on air photo interpretation. There was field work involved in a lot of this back then. And then you can see that some of these areas overlap one another, so you can have more than 10 points. And then ultimately, using this information, we create that environmental corridor boundary. And I didn't see where the purple line was when I was looking at this slide originally. But I'm assuming that it's really this green line. That for most purposes, that thick green line would be that environmental corridor delineation. As you can tell, there are polygons that are located outside that environmental corridor. Typically, it's because it doesn't have enough points, but it also could be because it doesn't meet size criteria or linkage criteria. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So we identify everything that's on a photograph that meets one of those natural resource-based elements or the natural resource-based related elements. We didn't limit to just what we thought was going to be the environmental corridor. We identified all of them. Next slide. There. See, I didn't do it this way. Okay. So now we're going to talk about individual elements. That's why it took so long to load. So we're talking about one of the foundations and backbones of all these environmental corridors. We quickly realized, and I think the earlier versions understood this as well, that were the earlier versions of corridors by Phil Lewis and Charles Whitnell also identified that a lot of these, the backbone of these corridors are the rivers and streams. And so then you can usually start from an understanding standpoint, from a mapping standpoint, to explain this to others. Just start with the backbone, start with the framework, and it's usually going to be a lake, river, or stream. Sometimes it's a large wetland complex. Sometimes it's a large woodland complex. Next. Next one. Oh, that was it. Okay. So that's the mapping effort that we went through back in the early 70s, or mid 70s, or not mid 70s, early 80s, using the 1975 aerial photograph. And then that's the only time we did that comprehensively everywhere. So that's still the foundation that we use for delineating corridors, delineating them in the field. If we're doing a major update in a sewer service area plan where a more refined or detailed delineation is appropriate. Any questions, any concerns, we'll go back to that 75 corridor composite as well. Consistency with that is a fairly important component of when we make recommendations on those sewer extensions when development is encroaching within or adjacent to the corridors. So I can't stress that enough. It still is an important factor. It will always be an important factor as long as we have this definition of corridors. So then again, I've talked about this a little bit. Once we've mapped all these areas, you start to notice that some of these areas overlap. When they have 10 points or more, they're eligible to be part of the environmental corridor. We're looking at the connectivity, contiguousness. There's certain size criteria that actually is right here, that also has to be met. So again, so now, talking about primary environmental corridors, that's 200 feet in width, 2 miles long, and 400 acres in size. To be a primary environmental corridor, it has to be that size, and it's got to be consisting, comprised of those natural resource elements and natural resource base related elements that are at least 10 points or more. Secondary environmental corridors, 1 mile long, 100 acres, no minimum width. Again, the idea here is a lot of these secondary environmental corridors are along the smaller streams. There's usually less natural resource features along those streams, or they're smaller. But we're also looking at these, we've always looked at these also from a wildlife standpoint, and having those corridors for wildlife to move along, for the vegetation as it, birds pick it up and drop the seeds, and the vegetation expands. Corridors are so critical to all those functions that we kept that in mind when we were coming up with these corridor definitions and the criteria and the sizing. We kept that all in mind. So we wanted to maintain those corridors. We want to maintain links. We wanted to link things as often as we could. And we didn't even have to force it, because when you start this exercise, and Phil Lewis was seeing this too, you start to do this exercise, it just jumps out at you, how it wants to be connected. That these lakes, rivers, and streams, sometimes wetland complexes, sometimes woodland complexes, just jumping out at you saying, we've already started a corridor here. So then we just took that idea and fleshed it out so that we understood that there are times when people will farm right up to the edge of a stream. There will be times where development will be right up to the edge of a lake or a major river. We try to maintain something there so we can maintain those links. So that's why there is no minimum width. Isolated natural resource areas have to be at least 5 acres in size, 200 feet wide. When you start delineating these, I think Chris is going to talk a little bit how skinny is too skinny. We don't really do fingers all over the place, but we'll do little nubs. The way I like to say it is, we don't like to add fingers to the corridor, because we try to maintain these size criteria and some other linkage criteria in a second. But little nubs, that's we always do. And it's very important to us as an agency to be consistent. So we've tried to maintain these standards from the very beginning. So once you learn our environmental corridor definition and the mapping criteria and the processes, very little changes over time. And that's important to us as an agency, because we're always encouraging everybody to put this in their local plans, to put this in their ordinances. And having previous jobs as a zoning enforcement officer, or being in charge of zoning enforcement officers, having this change on a semi-regular basis makes it much more difficult to enforce and regulate, and makes it much more difficult to explain to the average citizen or property owner that, if it's so important, why is it changing all the time? From those reasons, and I can't stress that enough, because we take that into account too, as an organization, and how we implement our recommendations, that's important to us too. We understand those issues that the local communities have. So it's important to us from just a consistency standpoint by itself, but it's also important because we understand that our partners, the local communities who may have adopted this in their plans, included it in their zoning ordinances. That consistency goes a long way. So sometimes that butts heads with, if you're looking at it from just the natural resource standpoint. What is the best thing for the environment? Yes, sometimes that will butt heads and contradict. But we feel that in the long range, big picture, this is the best way to do it. To be consistent, keep those kinds of things in mind, so that it makes it a little bit easier for our partners who try to do the right thing, try to enforce, or if it's not a zoning ordinance, most communities will have it in their comprehensive plans, so it's at least something to be considered. We try to work with them from that conceptual standpoint, and more specifically when specific projects come up to. Is there gonna be? Sure.
But didn't the secondary environmental corridors used to have a 100-foot width minimum?
It's like a guideline or a rule of thumb. That's what we try to establish. Chris will go into that in a little bit of detail too. But yes, so we don't just automatically go to the smallest possible. We're always shooting for that 100-foot width. And so sometimes if that is picking up an ag field, some of these natural resource bases that didn't have enough points to be a corridor by itself, we'll try to pick up those areas. Usually for the secondary, it's usually just a standard riparian buffer, 100 feet, something like that. That's what we're trying to do. But if there is a feature that's worthwhile, we'll pump that out and pick it up. But typically we'll stick to that 100 foot. And then another situation where that comes into play is in urbanizing areas or urban areas where the development has already encroached into that riparian shoreline area. We'll reflect that and still maintain that secondary corridor, even if it's so narrow it only contains the water itself. Because to us, maintaining that linkage is so important. And the linkage, when I talk about linkages, I'm talking about these secondaries are hopefully connecting primaries. There's a primary somewhere to the north, another one to the south. The only thing that's connecting them in this particular instance might be a stream. It has enough points to be our secondary environmental corridor. We want to retain that secondary environmental corridor. And we will, as long as that water feature is still there. Yes, if someday it ever became not navigable, there's a good chance we'd lose it. But until that point, all the navigable streams, very rare that somebody can get rid of a navigable stream. Move it, sure, then the corridor would move with that. But to get rid of it entirely, it's almost impossible. But I have seen it happen, again, in Brown County. But so no matter how narrow that gets, we want to maintain that corridor, we want to maintain that linkage. But that's not where we start. We start with that 100 foot as a guide. Next slide. Unless there was any other questions? So now I've been mentioning this continuity, connections, linkages. We do have distances. The premise, the idea is the larger the features you're trying to connect, the farther you can go to connect them. You're also trying to identify a location for that connection based on what's present on the ground. So you're not trying to go through the middle of a parking lot, you're trying to go through a farm field. The edge of a farm field where they've left some of the trees. You're trying to use those as the foundation of the linkages. And then none of those distances are in the PowerPoint itself. But I might have had a couple of specific examples in my notes. Nope, I did not. So I'll leave it there unless Dave thinks there's anything specific to mention in terms of
the continuity distance changes depending on the size of the resources that are being connected.
Yep.
I think the breakdown was like 5 to 19 acres so far, 20 to 39 acres, 40 to 79, 80. It's not a real big player in corridor delineation though. Mostly happens with resources that may be near a major lake where development is kind of cut it off. That's where that comes into play most often.
Yep. So it's something to keep in mind, but it isn't a big deal. I think it was a bigger deal when we were first doing this. But it can come up because of development, it can come up, farming activities change. They start farming a field that they hadn't farmed for 50 years. That could impact corridors and linkages. So some other special situations from a more technical standpoint, not the ones I'm going to talk about current development, sewer extension type stuff. Secondaries and corridors, we touched on that a little bit, how important it is to retain those areas, because we're trying to connect, in many instances, one primary to another primary. It's important where we stop. If it's not connecting primaries to one another, it's important where we stop. We won't just start with that skinny little piece of a lake, river, or a river or stream. It's got to have some kind of wetland or woodland complex that's large. That would be the start of that secondary environmental corridor. We're not just going to start it in the middle of nowhere along some little skinny little stream and keep it 100 foot or something. It's got to start with something bigger. And then the big point is we're trying to connect those primaries whenever possible, but we're not forcing it. There's got to be something there that meets the criteria. So we're not going to create something from scratch that doesn't meet the criteria. But we're always trying to, once we do establish that, we try to maintain it. And that's where the width doesn't become important anymore. Holes in the corridor comes up periodically too. We try to avoid holes in corridors in all instances. The DNR supports us on that as well for the sewer service area planning standpoint. But there are situations where they are holes. They're rare. We try to keep them very rare. And that's where historically and consistently there has been no resource there. And it's larger than 5 acres in size. The idea with somebody trying to, one of the ways we call it sometimes is like a spike cut. You find out it's a corridor. Why is it a corridor? It's woods, so I'll cut the woods down. Now it's not a corridor. No. The idea we also keep in mind is these things can change over time. Natural processes. There's a natural lightning strike, fire, trees burned down, corridor gone. No, stays. We have made what?
Emerald dashboard.
Yeah, I will be talking about that. That is one of the current situations that's starting to come up. So we have made a recent decision on that situation and any other similar ones that come up. But from the generic standpoint is yes, if consistently, historically, over time, there was a hole there, there were no resources there, larger than 5 acres or larger in size, yes, there could be a hole in that corridor. We would retain that as a hole in the corridor. But in many instances where it's changing time to time, because we get these aerial photographs going back to 1957 or something, we check. Wetland delineations have to check all the historic aerial photos too. We look to see, was that flip-flopping back and forth, hole, not a hole, hole, not a hole? It stays. It's a corridor. So next slide. So I've touched on some of this already, the differences inside the sewer service areas, we usually abbreviate that SSAs, and outside. So the big reason there's a difference, NR 121, that administrative code that talks about sewer service area planning, we use our environmental corridors as our version of these areas that can't be developed for sewer development, and it's sewer development, inside the sewer service areas because of the potential for adverse water quality impacts. We use our corridors for this purpose for NR 121. That's why there's a difference. So essentially the sewer development is limited or prohibited in the primaries and within the lowland portions of the secondaries and isolates. So if it's an upland portion of the secondary or isolated natural resource area, it's up to the local unit of government to protect it or not. We recommend that be protected, but we're not going to require it from the standpoint of our recommendation in a sewer extension or our recommendations in a sewer service area amendment. The lowland portions of those secondary corridors, and remember this came from the DNR, their policy statewide for a long time now, the 1990s, lowland portions of these secondaries and isolated, wetlands, floodplains, shorelands, what we call riparian buffers, and the adjacent steep slopes. Steep slopes, 12% or greater, adjacent being within 75 feet, direct connection. So if for some reason you had slopes that were adjacent to a wetland, that was part of the corridor. So now we're talking, and I think I'll be talking about it a little bit more in detail, but I'll start it now, so I'll finish now. The idea of being adjacent, we just figured that out recently too, by talking to the DNR, having a couple of situations come up in Burlington. So adjacent is within 75 feet, and it's got to be connected to, related to that environmental corridor. So in this case, it was a wetland, and there was the wetland slopes that were less than 12%, leading up to slopes that were greater than 12%. Within 75 feet, those steep slopes become part of the corridor. Become part of the corridor, that has to be protected from sewer development based on DNR and Department of Safety and Professional Services policy. But if, for instance, that steep slope sloped away from the wetland, even if it was within 75 feet, that would not be adequate. But it does have to slope to the wetland. Another situation, we just talked about these, because I always like to be prepared when these come up. What if there's a steep slope? Eventually it gets to the wetland. But like maybe the wetland is over there, here's the steep slope, but it goes that way first, then it goes that way, and then it finally gets to the wetland. If that path is more than 75 feet, it's not part of the corridor. So it's not adjacent then. So we've identified to some of those examples, DNR staff, and they concur. So that's our examples of what this adjacent steep slope only applies inside the sewer service areas for sewer development. Again, the steep slopes don't necessarily have to be within the environmental corridor. Because remember, this is related to the potential adverse water quality impact. So that corridor is a secondary importance to the DNR. Primary to the DNR, potential adverse water quality impact. So it doesn't have to be in the corridor. But we say then, whatever it's adjacent to has to be in the corridor. We're not just going to create this new feature in the middle of nowhere that has to be protected. It's going to have to be protecting something that was in the corridor. So a wetland, floodplain, shoreline that's in the corridor has to be adjacent to one of those. But the steep slopes itself could have been outside, probably because it wasn't enough points to be part of the corridor to begin with. And then that ultimate delineation, same thing. We don't want little fingers. Little nubs are okay. We don't want holes. We don't want islands. So that same thing applies with the steep slopes, because as you know, in steep slopes, it's not always just a wall of steep slope. Steep slope there, not steep there, 12% there, 25 there, 7 here. If it becomes like Swiss cheese, then most of that doesn't get included. So it's going to be a lot of case by case where there is a lot of variability in that degree of slope. Because we want that final result to be part of the corridor. It has to meet a criteria when I have little fingers and all that kind of stuff. Next slide. Again, another important thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with these corridors is, in addition to our generic recommendations that we talk about, that limited recreational, limited institutional, low density residential is allowed, we also have some additional permitted activities within corridors. Almost always case by case. So don't assume that every instance is going to be approved. There are going to be instances where it's not. A stormwater pond is permitted. Well, not if it's on a steep slope that could be impacting an adjacent wetland or something like that. We're going to recommend no. So it's case by case. Always keep that in mind. But there are a table, this table K1 in Appendix K of our regional land use and transportation plan that identifies all of those. And the footnotes in that table are equally important as well. So those footnotes will talk about other concepts that can apply. You can have, I hate to bring this up, but it's in there, the 10% rule. But you use that 10% rule no longer get to be able to use some of those other permitted activities. So it's case by case, and you also be, the 10% is usually by itself. It's a either or situation, not both. So then we're talking about the 10%. We're talking then in that instance, you'd be protecting the remainder of the corridor. We recommend conservation easement, deed restriction, something like that. We'll need the details for what that is. Some people like to keep track. They're not asking for the full 10% now, but they're going to eventually. So then they have to keep track of it. They need to let us know that. I'll leave it at that for now. I might touch on something later. Next bullet point is these environmental corridor delineations. So I keep talking about the sewer service area plans. I knew I was going to forget, that's why I put it there. It also applies to our review of subdivision plats. So I've talked about the sewer extension, I've talked about the sewer service area amendments, but I always forget about the subdivision plats. Same thing applies there. That we will talk about these things, what is allowed, what our recommendation is, and factor in whether that subdivision plat is inside a sewer service area or outside a sewer service area. We'll have the wording that reflects that in that letter. Those letters are just like everything else we do. It's only a recommendation. It is a law that says we're supposed to, or that the local communities are supposed to get that letter from us for all subdivision plats. Most communities don't, and we're not going to do it. We've never done anything about it, but they're supposed to, and some do. And so then we write those letters. And then one of the sections of each of those letters is the consistency with the environmental corridors, or conformance with the environmental corridors. So then we'll talk about the same stuff in that letter as we do in our sewer extensions. Whether that development is encroaching, if it is it compatible? Is it one of the permitted uses from the guidelines of development that's compatible with the corridors? Next one. There we go. So one of the more recent things we realized is, there are natural changes to environmental corridors happening all the time. We talked about some of them, like the hole, that the natural process is if there was a lightning strike and a fire, the trees burnt down, the corridor will come back, so we leave it as a corridor. Because we're not going to flip-flop all the time, it's in, it's out, it's in, so we're not going to do that. We're going to say it's in. It was, it burnt, it's going to come back, it's going to be in. But one of the exceptions that we did identify is tree die-off because of pests, disease, something like that. So the policy call, this is just us. This is usually, as far as I know, it's only going to apply in the upland areas, the parts that the DNR is not as concerned with. So then that's our recommendation and just our recommendation alone. If it's a pure stand of woods and it's all wiped out by some pest or disease or something like that, it's gone. As long as it's not a situation where it's a hole or a finger or something like that, it still has to meet the corridor criteria. So if it's some long, thin little ribbon inside the corridor surrounded by other stuff, we're not going to create a hole. It's going to stay. Corridor. We're talking about the situation of pure stand of woods on the edge of a corridor. Part of the corridor, but on the edge. Pure stand of woods, it all dies, the corridor is gone. Mixed stand of woods, some of the trees are dead, some are still living because it's mixed, it's got maples or oaks or something else in there. Corridor still stays. The original delineation still stays. We will look at it on a case by case. Was that mixed stand of woods on the edge, the edge of the edge, was that almost all entirely ash? Yeah, okay, then we'll take that part out. But that's a case by case call. So that's how we're dealing with those. That's a recent decision by our executive director. As far as I know, that's only going to apply in the upland areas. So the biggest thing to remember, it doesn't apply in the interior of the corridor. We're not going to have a hole. It's going to be on the edge of the corridor. It's going to be the upland area, and it's got to be a pure stand of woods. If it's mixed, it stays. If it's because part of our definition for woodlands, I didn't go into these definitions, by the way. Each one of those natural resource bases elements and natural base related elements, they all have a definition. So for woodlands, and Chris will be talking about this in his part. Nice that time. Chris is just getting anxious. He wants to talk. He wants me to stop. Woodland definition, there's a certain number of trees, canopy coverage, all that kind of stuff. So you'd be thinking, oh, enough of these trees were ashed, they're dead or dying, soon to be dead, mostly dead, which means partly alive, but that's a different story. You think, oh, it doesn't meet the definition anymore, so it all comes out. Because it's that natural function. Trees die, new trees come back. So we're taking this to be just that situation where it's a wholesale loss of trees. Pure stand of woods, they're all dead, they're all dying. Yes, on the edge, upland, they'll come out, not part of the corridor. Yes?
Is that the case if the woodland is the resource that's the reason for it being in the corridor?
Correct.
If it was also a steep slope and wildlife habitat?
If there were enough points remaining,
Right.
you take the 10 points off for the woods, but there's still enough points, 10, it still stays, yes. So it's got to meet the corridor criteria, size criteria. I did mention those, but I forgot to mention the points. So if it still has 10 points, even though the trees are gone, it's still part of the corridor. Just like, further down, that there could be that exact same situation. Now that steep slope, the most common would be steep slope and natural area. What else would be significant wildlife habitat? Because that was one of the changes we did. We had a high, medium, low. Now we just have one. They're all combined into 5 points for significant wildlife habitat. So there were 2 changes. We added critical species habitat sites as its own natural resource-based element, 5 points, and changed the high, medium, low, significant wildlife habitat to just 1 category, 5 points. So those were the 2 changes that we did make. I thought I forgot to mention that. So yes, so with those conditions, that the corridor point value is not met, you're not creating a problem from the size criteria, whole criteria. Upland, it's only an upland, it's pure stand of woods, yep, it's gone. Woodland management, we're getting those questions a little bit more often. Yes, you can do woodland management. The understanding though is if you want to find a forester who says the best thing to do is clear cut the area, no. We're going to recommend no. The corridor has to stay. So again, we only recommend, we can't stop that, but from our sewer service area planning purposes, our sewer extension review purposes, that corridor is still there. It was like a spike cut.
What if it's a plantation?
Pine plantations are different. We did identify most of those as part of the corridor originally, but if we find out, if somebody can show to us that was planted for commercial purposes, maintained for commercial purposes, it does not stay part of the corridor. Again, with the criteria, if there's enough points for the corridor to remain, then it's still a corridor. If it's creating a hole, we won't allow a hole. Although I suppose theoretically, if the hole was larger than 5 acres, it could become a hole. But that's only, pine or plantations for commercial purposes, originally and maintained. And so then that would have to be shown by the local community, the property owner, whoever. It would be up to them to show that it was planted for commercial purposes and maintained for commercial purposes. So the woodland management, so selective cut, removing invasives, sure. But if you get too crazy about it, start taking out enough that it no longer meets the corridor woodland definition. Corridor's gone. Nope, we're gonna keep the corridor there. And then encroachments in the critical species habitat sites. So again, by themselves, a critical species habitat site is not enough points to be a corridor, but in combinations with other things, it could be. What we're saying there is if it's an upland area, it's a critical species habitat site, maybe it's got steep slopes, whatever, it's got enough points to be corridor, so it is part of the corridor. But it's that upland portion of the corridor, even if it's in a primary, that 10% rule could potentially come into play. But if it's a critical, so it's gone, it can be removed. But we would recommend that you try to work with us to identify whatever plants, if it's plants, what they are, and relocate them. So far, we've been successful. As far as I know, every time that's come up, we've told the developer and the community, it's always, we need both to be on board with this. They have always agreed to relocate those. We'll see, it's relatively new. We'll see how well they survive in their new spots. But we will always recommend that they relocate those. If it's an area where they can encroach, we'll ask if they can relocate them. So far, everybody's agreed to do that. But that's just a recommendation. We have no enforcement on that beyond what the local unit of government is able and willing to do themselves. But like I said, in the 2, 3, 4 instances that this has happened now, maybe a couple more, but half a dozen at the most, the developer / property owner has always been willing to do this. So those are the most common new type issues related to corridors, primarily related to mapping corridor or what kind of activities are allowed within the corridor. There are other really rare ones that I wasn't going to talk about, but if questions come up, we'll be able to. That might be it. Is there one more? No, that's it. So, bottom line, I can't stress enough, we only recommend. Sometimes when we talk about this stuff, it sounds like we require things.